The Missing Mayor's Daughter, a Bernard Miller Mystery, Part 1, A Silent Cry. New York City at dawn had its own unique rhythm. The sidewalks, normally teeming with energy, were muted in the early morning light, the streets bathed in the glow of street lamps and scattered neon signs still lingering from the night before. Bernard Miller felt the quiet unease in the air as he stepped out of his car, his eyes tracing the stately line of townhouses in this wealthy corner of the Upper East Side. The mayor's call had come through his private line barely an hour earlier, carrying an urgency that still echoed in his mind. This hour was usually reserved for breakfast with kids, yet here he was, answering a summons he could not refuse. Mayor Frank McIntyre, a man Bernard had always seen as unshakable, looked like a shadow of himself. His face was drained of color, his hands twitching restlessly by his sides as he struggled to hold himself together. By his side, Jeanette McIntyre seemed even worse. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes red from a night of sleepless worry. In her hand, she clutched a crumpled piece of paper, as if her life depended on it. "Bernie," Jeanette whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, you're our only hope." She handed him the note, her fingers lingering on the edge before finally releasing it. Bernard straightened the page and scanned the words, each line heavy with a dark promise. No police, no FBI. $5 million or your daughter Julia will be sent back to you piece by piece. The words hung in the air, cruelly unyielding. Bernard read it again, this time more slowly, as if the details might reveal some hidden clue, something that could give him an edge. But the letter was coldly precise, and he knew the kidnappers were serious. "Tell me everything," Bernard said, his gaze meeting Frank's. The mayor's face, usually full of command and confidence, was filled with fear and desperation. He nodded and glanced at Jeanette, who closed her eyes, taking a steadying breath before beginning. "Julia attended an event last night," Jeanette explained, her voice trembling. "It was a charity gala in Midtown, and she was one of the featured models. She left with her driver around 11. She was supposed to meet us afterward, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "She never came home." Frank stepped in, his voice rough with frustration. "The driver told us he dropped her off at her apartment around midnight. Everything seemed fine, but this note was waiting for us when we got home." He rubbed his temples, his eyes closed as if trying to block out the image of that dreadful message. Bernard nodded, processing the timeline. It was clear the kidnappers knew the McIntyres' routines well. He had to wonder how long they'd been planning this, or whether there had been signs, threats, suspicious behavior that the family might have missed. Moments later, the doorbell rang, and Detectives Cynthia Toussaint and Hector Ramirez arrived. Bernard was grateful to see them. He trusted them implicitly. As he introduced the detectives to the McIntyres, he saw the faintest glimmer of relief in Frank's eyes. As if knowing he had an entire team on his side brought a measure of comfort. Bernard kept his voice calm and steady, guiding the family through each question with care, as the detectives took note of every detail. Cynthia spoke up, addressing Frank and Jeanette with a quiet, reassuring confidence. "Our goal is to keep this discreet while tracking Julia's location. The fewer people involved, the better our chances." The McIntyres nodded, grateful yet visibly burdened by the secrecy required. Jeanette's hand tightened around Frank's arm as if drawing strength from him. Bernard couldn't help but feel the weight of their silent plea. "Let's start with Julia's last known movements," Bernard suggested, gently guiding their focus to the next step. If she was targeted, then someone had to have been watching her for days, maybe even weeks. Hector stepped forward, taking notes as he asked, "Do you know if Julia noticed anything odd recently? Strange cars, unfamiliar people? Even small things could be important." Jeanette shook her head slowly, lost in thought. "She never mentioned anything to us. She lives alone, but she seemed fine, happy." "All right," Bernard said, offering a steady presence as he prepared for the challenges ahead. "Let's go through her contacts. Every person she spoke with in the last 48 hours. Colleagues, friends, anyone." They worked through potential leads, piecing together Julia's last steps like a mosaic. The more details they uncovered, the more Bernard felt the stakes rise. These kidnappers were playing a meticulous game, and time was not on their side. Part 2. Tracing Shadows. Morning had turned to afternoon, as Bernard and his team dug into the trail left by Julia's last movements. In their makeshift office back at headquarters, they sorted through every available record of her interactions at the gala. The security footage, interviews with guests, and Julia's most recent social media posts, all pieced together in a desperate attempt to find any sign of a shadow trailing her that night. As they reviewed the footage again, Bernard's gaze lingered on a figure, a man moving through the edges of the scene, his gaze fixed on Julia whenever she appeared in view. He wore a cap that obscured most of his face, but his posture, just slightly tense, gave him away as someone out of place among the gala's upscale guests. He hovered at the edge of Julia's circle, his interest too intense to go unnoticed. "Hold up." Cynthia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she focused on a small detail on the man's jacket. A barely visible emblem was stitched near his shoulder. She quickly enhanced the image, and the fuzzy outline of a logo became clearer. A red anchor encircled by dark waves. "See that symbol?" Cynthia pointed. "It's for Red Harbor Transport, a shipping company operating out of the docks on the west side. They're not exactly known for good business practices. I've seen their name come up in a few cases involving smuggling and illegal cargo shipments. Word on the street is that they're a front for certain criminal organizations." "Think it's our lead?" Hector asked, shifting forward in his seat, his gaze fixed on the screen. "It's something," Bernard replied, trying to keep his voice neutral, though his mind was already making connections. If Red Harbor was involved, this went beyond a simple kidnapping. He could sense a deliberate, calculated operation, the kind that required resources, manpower, and serious risk. Whoever had taken Julia was playing a bigger game than just ransom. Without wasting time, they headed to the docks where Red Harbor operated. The industrial stretch along the Hudson was busy, filled with workers loading and unloading containers, a constant movement of trucks and freight cars. They split up, blending in with the flow of workers as they moved through the area, questioning employees and scanning for any sign of a black van like the one in the footage. Hector flagged down one of the foremen, flashing his private investigator badge and casually mentioning that he was just here about a security matter involving one of their clients. The foreman seemed wary, but eventually gestured over to a man sitting on a stack of pallets, watching the river with a cigarette in hand. "That's Louis. He's been here longer than anyone else. If anyone saw something unusual, he would have." Bernard approached Louis, who gave him a long, knowing look before exhaling a cloud of smoke and speaking in a gravelly voice. "I don't talk to cops." "Not a cop," Bernard replied smoothly, offering a slight nod. "Private investigator, just trying to help a family find their daughter. You don't have to say a word, but anything you might have seen, well, it could make all the difference." Louis squinted at Bernard, then sighed, shaking his head as he took another drag. "Yeah, well, I did see something the other night. Black van, windows tinted, came barreling out of here around midnight. Usually, the vans are loaded slow, then take their time. This one, it was in a hurry, like it had somewhere it needed to be." "Headed where?" Bernard asked, trying not to show the tension rising in him. "Van was heading west, fast," Louis mumbled. "Last I saw, it was turning onto the highway, maybe going upstate." Bernard felt a faint spark of hope. The van was their first concrete lead. They still didn't know who was in it or exactly where it went, but they finally had something tangible to follow. He exchanged a look with Cynthia and Hector, and they all understood each other. This wasn't much, but it was a start. The van was their link, a thin thread leading them closer to Julia and her captors. As they thanked Louis and made their way back, Bernard felt the familiar mix of adrenaline and worry. If they could trace the van's route, maybe find where it had been seen on security cameras or flagged by tolls, it might just lead them to the kidnappers' hideout. But he also knew that time was slipping away, and each hour that passed made Julia's safe return less certain. The clock was ticking, and the shadows were beginning to close in. Part 3. The chase begins. The Bronx alley was a mess of shadows, discarded trash and graffiti-covered walls. It wasn't the place they'd expected the kidnappers to abandon their van, yet here it was, parked conspicuously as if meant to be found. As Bernard approached, he felt the eerie calm of the scene, the kind that suggested it had all been set up, staged for their benefit. The kidnappers wanted them to see this. But why? Inside the van, Bernard and Cynthia scanned the interior while Hector kept a lookout. The vehicle was spotless, almost unnaturally so, but as Bernard searched the seams between the seats and floor mats, his fingers brushed against a single blonde hair tangled in the upholstery. He carefully extracted it, his gaze hardening as he held it up to the light. "It's a match for Julia," Cynthia said quietly, her tone conveying both relief and concern. They finally had physical evidence that Julia had been there. But it wasn't much to go on. The hair was both a clue and a taunt. The kidnappers were leaving just enough to keep them engaged, as though leading them down a trail of breadcrumbs. Bernard's phone buzzed in his pocket, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered, bringing the phone to his ear. The voice on the other end was distorted, as if filtered through a voice changer. It was cold, mechanical, yet maddeningly calm. "You need to stop following us. You have the instructions. $5 million, no interference." Bernard's heart rate spiked, his grip tightening on the phone. "Who are you? Where's Julia?" Silence. Before he could say more, the line went dead, leaving only the sound of his own breathing echoing in his ears. Bernard lowered the phone, his mind racing. The kidnappers were aware of their every move, which meant they were watching closely. Cynthia moved closer, her expression a mix of frustration and worry. "They know we're on to them. They're warning us off." "This just got even riskier," Hector added, casting a wary look around the alley. "If they're watching, they could be one step ahead. They might just be leading us in circles." But Bernard wasn't willing to back down. If anything, this call only solidified his resolve. The voice had betrayed something that Bernard recognized, a need for control. Whoever was behind this wanted to manage every aspect of the game. They'd anticipated his reaction and expected compliance. That meant they thought they were untouchable. With the hair secured as evidence, Bernard signaled for the team to pull out. "Let's regroup at headquarters. We're missing something here, and I want to know what it is before we make our next move." Back at their office, they arranged every piece of evidence on the table. The ransom note, security footage, photos of the van, the hair. Each piece was a part of the puzzle, but nothing connected just yet. Bernard knew they were under pressure to act quickly, yet a single misstep could trigger the very outcome they feared most. The McIntyres arrived soon after, having been told of the call. Jeanette's face was etched with worry, her hands twisting together as she took in the evidence laid out before her. "What did they say?" Frank asked, his voice strained as he locked eyes with Bernard. Bernard explained the brief call, watching as both parents struggled to maintain their composure. "The kidnappers want the money, nothing more. But they also warned us to back off, which means they know exactly what we're doing." Jeanette's eyes flashed with a new wave of fear. "Bernard, please, whatever they want, we have to get Julia back." Bernard placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're doing everything we can, but there's something in this we're not seeing yet. I promise we're close." Once the McIntyres left, he gathered his team in a close huddle. The stakes were rising, and so was the pressure. "Let's reevaluate every piece of evidence," he instructed, scanning their faces. "There's something we're missing. A link. A pattern. These people are methodical, but they're human. There's always a flaw. Let's find it." As they combed through the evidence, Bernard's mind drifted to the one clear message from the call. "You have the instructions." The kidnappers were taunting him, perhaps banking on the assumption that the ransom alone would keep him from digging deeper. "Think about this," he said suddenly, his mind racing. "If they've gone to the trouble of planning this entire scheme and setting up obstacles, there's a reason. We need to figure out why they're pushing us toward that ransom drop and what they gain from us playing along." He leaned over the ransom note, tracing his finger over the threatening words. It was all designed to control, to instill fear, but if they could see past the theatrics, maybe they'd find the real motive lurking beneath. "From here on, we don't just follow instructions," he said, his voice firm. "We'll keep them thinking we're playing along, but we're going to dig deeper than they ever anticipated." Part 4. The Deceptive Trail. Dawn broke with tense anticipation as Bernard and his team waited for confirmation that the ransom had been received. They watched the minutes tick by, expecting the kidnappers to contact them with instructions to release Julia. But as the hours passed with only silence, a gnawing feeling settled in Bernard's gut. Something wasn't right. Finally, around noon, another note arrived at the McIntyre's townhouse. Bernard opened it cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he read the words printed in sharp, cold letters. "You're close, but not close enough." Cynthia shook her head, her frustration evident. "They're toying with us. This isn't just a ransom. They have a larger plan, and it's clearly not just about the money." Bernard nodded, his mind racing. "We need a fresh angle," he murmured, recalling someone who could bring new insights. He picked up his phone and called Dr. Alan Harris, a criminal psychologist he'd worked with on other high-stakes cases. Harris had an uncanny ability to get inside a criminal's head, spotting motivations that others often missed. When Dr. Harris arrived at their office, he listened intently as Bernard and the team recapped everything that had happened: the ransom demand, the misleading clues, the calculated silence from the kidnappers. Harris tapped his pen thoughtfully, his brow furrowing. "These kidnappers are sophisticated," he said slowly, glancing between Bernard and Cynthia. "They're not just in it for the money. Ransom is only one piece of the puzzle. From what you've described, I'd say their aim is likely to humiliate or punish the mayor. Someone has a personal vendetta against him." Hector raised an eyebrow. "You think they're using Julia as a pawn in some larger scheme?" "Exactly," Harris replied. "The fact that they allowed you to find the abandoned van, the taunting note, they're intentionally giving you crumbs to keep you on edge. It's about control, yes, but also about making the mayor feel powerless. Whoever planned this wants to send a message." Taking Harris's insight to heart, Bernard ordered a search into McIntyre's political history, looking for any adversaries or disgruntled associates. Meanwhile, Bernard began cross-referencing Julia's social circles with those who might harbor a vendetta. After hours of investigation, a breakthrough came. They found a connection between the mayor's recent policies and a group of local business owners who had suffered significant losses due to new zoning laws that favored large-scale developers. A few of the owners had gone bankrupt, including a businessman named Victor Lane, a known associate of Red Harbor Transport, the company connected to the suspicious man at the gala. Lane's financial empire had crumbled, and the mayor's decisions were a direct cause. The team followed this lead to an abandoned warehouse listed as a Red Harbor Transport holding. Located on the outskirts of Brooklyn, it was in a quiet industrial zone, away from prying eyes, an ideal hideout for anyone wanting to keep a captive. As they arrived at the warehouse, Bernard signaled for silence, and they moved stealthily through the shadows, guns drawn, nerves taut. The building's decaying walls and scattered debris created an oppressive atmosphere, and every footstep echoed like a warning in the empty, dark space. "Julia?" Bernard called out softly, his voice cutting through the silence. A faint rustling came from a corner of the room. He moved closer, and there, bound to a chair, was Julia. Her face was pale, but her eyes lit up with relief as she recognized Bernard and his team. They quickly freed her from the ropes, Cynthia and Hector checking for injuries, though she appeared unharmed aside from a few scrapes. Bernard dialed the McIntyres, his voice steady as he reassured them that their daughter was safe. Frank and Jeanette's sighs of relief were almost palpable over the phone, and for a moment, Bernard allowed himself to believe that the case was closed. But a nagging thought lingered in his mind, a sense that something crucial had been overlooked. As he looked around the warehouse, he noticed small but deliberate signs, scattered papers, a cup half filled with cold coffee. It seemed as if someone had left in a hurry, but intentionally left traces behind, almost like a breadcrumb trail. He wondered if they'd stumbled onto the location too easily, if the discovery of the abandoned van, the taunting notes, and now Julia herself had been part of a larger plan. Dr. Harris's words echoed in his mind. The kidnappers want to make the mayor feel powerless. It dawned on Bernard that this was only one part of the plan. The real endgame was likely still unfolding. Somewhere, someone was waiting for them to drop their guard. He exchanged a wary glance with Cynthia and Hector. "We've got Julia safe, but I don't think we're out of the woods yet," he said, his voice low. "These people have been 2 steps ahead from the start. There's something bigger here, something we haven't seen. They had saved Julia, but as they prepared to leave the warehouse, Bernard couldn't shake the sense that they were on the brink of uncovering the true scope of the scheme, and he was determined to expose it before the kidnappers' ultimate plan could strike. Part 5: The Revelation. Julia's safe return brought relief, but for Bernard and his team, it was far from a victory. The kidnappers' plan, they realized, had to be more than a straightforward abduction. Every clue had been calculated to mislead them, forcing Bernard to consider that Julia's kidnapping had been a diversion, a means to a darker, more personal end. Back at the office, Bernard sat with Julia, hoping she could recall anything that might illuminate the kidnappers' true motives. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she recounted her experience. "There was a man," she said, her hands clasped tightly. "He kept saying that my father would pay, that he would regret every decision he'd ever made." The word sent a chill through Bernard. This wasn't just about money. Whoever had taken Julia harbored a deep, personal vendetta against her father, and the ransom demand was merely a smokescreen. Bernard shared the revelation with Cynthia, Hector, and Dr. Harris, who immediately began delving into Mayor McIntyre's history, searching for anyone who might bear a grudge strong enough to warrant such a calculated scheme. Hours of investigation led them to uncover a series of controversial policy changes in McIntyre's career, several of which had caused severe financial fallout for many New York businesses. A key decision stood out. McIntyre's zoning reforms had heavily favored corporate developers, forcing many small business owners to close shop. One name surfaced repeatedly in connection with these changes: a former real estate developer and minor political figure named Edward Halloran. Halloran had once been one of the city's most prominent real estate moguls, but McIntyre's policies had effectively dismantled his empire. Disgraced and financially ruined, Halloran had vanished from the public eye for years. Quietly, he'd been funneling what remained of his resources into meticulously planning his revenge. It was clear that for Halloran, the kidnapping was a means to devastate McIntyre on a deeply personal level. With a new target in mind, Bernard and his team tracked Halloran to a secluded property on Staten Island, a remnant of his former empire. They moved in at dusk, each step echoing with the tension of knowing their final confrontation was near. Inside the dimly lit property, they found Halloran seated behind a desk, his expression grim yet oddly satisfied. He made no move to escape, his eyes narrowing as Bernard approached. "You've made your point," Bernard said, keeping his voice steady. "Julia's safe, it's over." Halloran smiled, a bitter edge to his voice. "Safe? Safe is the one thing Frank McIntyre's never been. He took everything from me. I just wanted him to feel a fraction of what I lost." Bernard's jaw tightened. "So you used his daughter, his family, to get your revenge?" Halloran shrugged. "I did what I had to. Frank needed to understand what it feels like to lose, to be powerless." As Cynthia and Hector secured Halloran, he showed no remorse, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of someone who believed they'd delivered justice in their own twisted way. With Halloran in custody, Bernard and his team finally had answers. Yet as they drove back to the precinct, Bernard felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Halloran's calculated vengeance was a reminder that the thirst for power and revenge could drive a person to unimaginable cruelty. For Frank McIntyre, the victory came with a painful lesson about the consequences of his own actions, ones that had inadvertently placed his daughter in harm's way. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Bernard leaned against the precinct's exterior, watching as the city lights flickered on. The case was over, and Julia was safe. But the dark complexities of human motives, the webs of vengeance and justice, lingered in Bernard's mind. There was peace in knowing that justice had been served, yet Bernard knew that his journey would always circle back to these shadows, testing his resolve. Tonight, however, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, embracing the quiet satisfaction of a hard-fought victory. Part 6. As the last remnants of daylight slipped beneath the Manhattan skyline, Bernard steered his car through the quiet streets. His eyes drifted over the cityscape, casting a reflective glow across the dashboard. The case had tested him deeply, not just in its pursuit of justice, but in its exploration of the delicate, blurred line between justice and vengeance. one he had tread many times himself. After Halloran's chilling confession, Julia had been reunited with her family, visibly scarred and grateful to be safe, but carrying a weight that would take time to lift. Her ordeal had transformed the McIntyres, shaking them to their core. Frank McIntyre, who once saw his career as a public service worth any sacrifice, now realized the very real cost it could demand from those he loved most. As Bernard returned to his own home that evening, he was greeted by the laughter of his children, Tasha and Anthony, playing quietly under Tanisha's watchful eye. He lingered at the doorway for a moment, savoring their joy. He felt an overwhelming gratitude for their innocence, a stark reminder of how fragile and precious it truly was. Bernard's thoughts turned to Fiona, his late wife, and the heavy cost of the path he'd chosen, both for himself and for those closest to him. The front door opened, and his in-laws, Catherine and Joe, stepped in, carrying bags from their trip to the market. Catherine caught his eye, her gaze softening with understanding. She walked over, placing a warm hand on his shoulder. There was nothing she needed to say. Her presence was grounding. Bernard knew they understood the toll each case took on him, but they also knew the deeper reasons why he continued, why he couldn't simply walk away. As Bernard looked over at his children, he felt a renewed determination to protect this fragile happiness, to keep it safe from the darkness he encountered daily. His son, Anthony, glanced up from his game and smiled, a quick but genuine moment of joy that reminded Bernard of his purpose. He promised silently to shield them from as much of the world's cruelty as he could. Later, after the house had settled into a comforting quiet, Bernard stood by his window, watching the city lights glimmer in the distance. The city continued to pulse with life, and he knew that in its shadows lurked more who would need his help, more who had suffered. Yet tonight, he allowed himself a moment of calm, free from that weight. His family was the light that guided him through the darkest corners of his work and his memories, giving him strength. In this small, fleeting space of time, he was just Bernard. A father, a protector, a man who had returned home. Whatever awaited him in the days ahead, he was ready to face it, anchored by the love of those he cherished most.